Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a massive 400-year epic. We're talking about how the absolute largest empire in human history was born, how it exploded in size, and then how it rapidly fell apart. It's a wild story full of global trade, industrial might, fierce resistance, and a completely shifting world order.
Now, to really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this, just think about this number: 1/4. At its absolute peak, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land area. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the surface area of the Moon. We're talking hundreds of millions of people across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and the Pacific. They had the world's most dominant navy, and London became the literal financial beating heart of an expanding global economy. There was a time when you could say, without any exaggeration whatsoever, that the sun never set on the British Empire.
But all of this begs a massive, honestly fascinating question, right? How exactly did a relatively small, rainy island nation become the command center for the biggest empire the world has ever seen? And maybe even more importantly, how did that very same empire, after completely dominating the globe for generations, unravel so incredibly fast?
Well, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to follow this empire's complete life cycle through 4 distinct chapters. First, origins of an empire. Then, engines of imperial power. Moving into the Great Unraveling. And finally, the legacy left behind.
So, let's jump right into Chapter 1, Origins of an Empire, from Exploration to Conquest.
We actually have to rewind way back, long before the empire hit its peak. In the 16th century, England was really just scrambling to get a piece of the global trade pie, trying to keep up with heavyweights like Spain and Portugal. By 1600, they formed the East India Company, and over the next century or so, Britain fought tooth and nail for control of global trade. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763, which tipped the global balance of power heavily in Britain's favor. But then, 1783 hit. The American Revolution was a massive disaster for them. They lost all 13 North American colonies. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. Britain didn't fold. Instead, they just completely redirected their ambitions. They pivoted hard toward India, colonized Australia, pushed across the Pacific, and just kept building up their naval dominance, cementing the whole thing at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805.
You really have to consider this incredibly bizarre historical reality about the East India Company. See, it started off as a basic, private trading firm. Its only goal, make some money trading in Asia. But over time, it morphed into this massive territorial superpower. Imagine if a modern tech giant like Apple or Google just suddenly started building its own private armies, signing international treaties, fighting literal wars, and collecting taxes. Because that is exactly what this corporation did, eventually taking control of huge chunks of India. It's honestly one of the strangest developments in all of history.
Moving on to Chapter 2, Engines of Imperial Power, Navy, Industry, and India. So how did Britain accelerate this growth into a sprawling global system? Well, it wasn't just blind luck. It was this unstoppable feedback loop. First, you had the Royal Navy out there protecting trade routes, moving troops, and projecting just massive military might. Second, the Industrial Revolution kicks into high gear. Now you have coal-powered steam engines moving goods faster than ever before. But here's the catch. Those new factories desperately needed raw materials, and they needed new markets to sell all those manufactured goods to. And third, you have India. For centuries, India was one of the wealthiest regions on the planet, and it became the commercial engine feeding this massive, integrated global machine.
But as you can imagine, this immense level of control caused enormous disruption, and local resistance never just went away. In 1857, Indian soldiers serving in the East India Company's army rebelled. The revolt spread incredibly fast, leading to casualties among British civilians and soldiers alike. In response, British forces used brutal, overwhelming repression to crush the uprising. The fallout from this was huge. By 1858, the British government stepped in, completely dissolved the East India Company, and kicked off the British Raj. This meant India was now ruled directly by the British Crown, with Queen Victoria eventually being declared Empress of India.
The real secret to how they managed such a vast, sprawling territory was incredible flexibility. Britain didn't just use a one-size-fits-all approach. Sometimes it was direct conquest, where they brought places like Canada or Australia under direct British administration. Other times, they relied on indirect rule. This meant leaving local rulers in power, but basically forcing them to operate under very heavy British influence. And in some other regions, their power was strictly commercial, meaning just raw economic dominance without ever formally taking over the territory. It was highly adaptable for sure, but it also created staggering inequalities, as colonial populations frequently lacked even the most basic political rights that British subjects had back home.
Now let's look at Chapter 3, The Great Unraveling, World Wars and Decolonization.
Ironically enough, the very system Britain built eventually created the tools for its own downfall. British infrastructure, like railways, connected people across vast distances. Western-style education introduced new political concepts, which allowed local political organizations to form, grow, and start demanding self-government. And once that catalyst hit, the collapse was blindingly fast. We're talking about centuries of expansion being dismantled in just a matter of decades. It started with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, moved to the monumental milestone of Indian and Pakistani independence in 1947, swept right through African decolonization in the 1960s, and concluded symbolically with the handover of Hong Kong in 1997.
So what actually triggered such a rapid decline? Well, first, the absolute immense resource drain of World War I severely cracked Britain's financial foundations. Then came World War II, and even though Britain survived the threat of Nazi Germany, the country was left completely economically exhausted. The global balance of power permanently shifted away from London, moving over to the United States and the Soviet Union. And at the exact same time, mass political resistance and nationalist movements, like Mahatma Gandhi's massive campaigns of civil disobedience and boycotts in India, became completely impossible for a weakened British government to ignore any longer.
But it is super important to understand that decolonization was incredibly complex and very often deeply tragic. Take 1947, for example. British India finally gained independence, but that milestone came at a terrible price. The subcontinent was partitioned into two new nations, India and Pakistan. This meant drawing entirely new borders, which sparked the mass migration of millions of people. It tragically erupted into horrific communal violence, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths. It was undeniably one of the most consequential moments in the empire's collapse, but it was a profoundly painful one.
And 1947 was really just the start of this massive decolonization domino effect. India and Pakistan's independence was followed a decade later by Ghana in 1957 and then Nigeria in 1960. This kicked off a massive wave of independence across African, Asian, and Caribbean colonies. Now, as some of these transitions were relatively peaceful, others turned into long, violent wars of independence. This whole domino effect finally culminated in 1997 when Hong Kong was transferred back to China. For a lot of historians, that moment represents the formal end of a colonial era that had lasted for literally centuries.
Which brings us to our final chapter, the legacy left behind, the ghost in the machine.
When we look back, the history of this empire is a striking duality. You really can't just reduce it to pure achievement or pure destruction. On the one hand, it was undeniably transformative. It created vast global connections and spread new technologies, infrastructure, and languages all over the planet. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that this entire system relied inherently on coercion, severe economic exploitation, deeply unequal political systems, and rigid racial hierarchies. It was a profoundly complicated era that completely reshaped the world, for better and for worse.
So, what exactly does the post-imperial world look like for us today? Well, just think about the language you're listening to right now. The English language, along with British legal and educational systems, spread everywhere. Yes, Britain returned to being a smaller post-imperial state, but the Commonwealth emerged to link a lot of those former colonies, and London still remains a major global financial hub today. And critically, if you just pull up a modern map or turn on the evening news, a lot of the borders and ongoing conflicts you see across South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, those stem directly from decisions made during this exact era of European dominance.
The empire disappeared. Its consequences did not. I think the ultimate takeaway here is that no empire is permanent. Power can seem totally unstoppable, literally for generations. And then, within just a few short decades, the entire political map of the entire world can flip completely upside down. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling question for our own time. In today's world of global superpowers and unprecedented massive megacorporations, who is building the next invisible empire? And how long until it falls?